I think I'm going to begin the introductions, and by the time I've got through the enormously long CVs of my two early modern colleagues, we might be at the end of our session. No, that's unfair, because Ethan, whose voice I am again saving, didn't write an introduction down for himself. So he's going to actually be very short. Well, there's the four of us who've subjected you to this weekend of activities thought that we should have this final plenary session where we wrap up and tackle the contentious issue of periodization. So we're going to go in the order that I read these introductions. So Ethan Shagan is very happily a new and recent colleague of mine at Berkeley, where he came from Northwestern via Harvard Society of Fellows and did his graduate work at Princeton, which seems to be about just every other person in this room seems to have done. He is the author of the prize-winning Popular Politics in the English Reformation in 2003 and the edited collection Catholics in the Protestant Nation in 2005, and is working on a big second book on the history of moderation during the Reformation. Stephen Pincus is, as you all know, a professor of history at Yale, where he moved from the University of Chicago. He received his PhD from Harvard in 1990, since which time he has written, and I'm going to have that feeling of inadequacy again, Protestantism and Patriotism, Ideologies in the Making of English Foreign Policy, 1650 to 1668, that came out in 96. England's Glorious Revolution, 1688 to 1809, with Palgrave in 2006. And just this month, his new book has appeared from Yale University Press, 1688, The First Modern Revolution. Frederick Alberton Johnson is an assistant professor of history at the University of Chicago, where he also received his PhD in 2005. And I personally, having been hired by the institution where I did my graduate work, know what a tough assignment that is. He's written widely on the intersection between the economy and the environment in the 18th century, and is currently preparing a book manuscript called Nature's Commerce, the Scottish Highlands in the Age of Empire and the Enlightenment. James Vernon James Vernon is a professor of history at UC Berkeley. He received his PhD in 1991 from the University of Manchester, where he taught for 9 years before coming to Berkeley in 2000. He's the author of not many books, including, actually he's forgotten one, including Politics and the People in 1993, damn good book, now out in paperback, and Hunger, A Modern History, a really fantastic book, published in Harvard, by Harvard in 2007. So, Ethan.
Thanks, and I'm going to try to use this microphone enough so you can actually hear me, despite my voice fading. So I want to do two things briefly. The first question I want to ask on the subject, when it was the state, is a sort of apologia, and that is, why does this conference begin circa 1500 rather than circa 1200? During the High Middle Ages, England developed a bureaucracy that successfully collected taxes from all men of property, both men and property being operative words, but it did so. It developed a system of royal judges who decided legal cases throughout the realm according to a common law. It developed a sufficiently robust sense of political unity that a few hundred men in a new institution called Parliament, a talking place, helped create, enforce, and legitimize the policies of the monarchy. Medievalists call this the origins of the modern state, so why aren't they here today? One easy answer is we didn't have room to invite them. Another answer is they're sort of annoying. Another answer is probably we should have. But I have an answer to this question. It may not be a very good answer, and I certainly can't prove it, but at least it's provocative. And that is, what makes the 16th century state different from the 13th century state is a change in the nature of that state's subjects. To put it bluntly, 16th century subjects were becoming dangerously ungovernable by medieval means. The Reformation and Counter-Reformation injected ideology into politics for the first time and suggested to at least some people the benefits of an unmediated individual moral compass. Demographic change, especially population growth and consequent inflation, ripped large numbers of people out of their communities and set them off down the roads in search of work. The growth of the market helped some men and a few women grow too big for their traditional social environments, straining the ethical relations governing community life. In sum, something like the modern, deracinated, bounded individual came into, if not existence, then at least prominence. And I would argue that the growth of the modern state was precisely a solution to the problem of the modern individual. While the technologies of the medieval state had governed communities, estates, or corporations, the technologies of the early modern state would instead govern people. Technologies that in England included first and foremost the invention of the civil parish, the paradigmatic unit and agent of the early modern English state, with its precise lists of births, marriages, and deaths, its poor rates, its passports for travelers, and so forth. The so-called disciplinary revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries was precisely a process of, to borrow James Scott's terminology, making individuals legible to the modern state. So that's something like an argument about when modernity and why. An argument that no doubt Steve will disagree with, but at least puts something out there for the sort of old-fashioned thesis of a 16th century modern state. So that's thought number one, and it fits with our Mellon Grant studying the origins of modernity. But thought number two is that that doesn't mean I think modernity is really the most interesting lens through which to study the British state. And in fact, I'm strongly against any study of the state that takes the question of when and how it became modern as its primary focus. And again, here I think I'm in disagreement with other members of the panel. Because while the modern state may have been created as a solution to the problem of the modern individual, that doesn't mean the modern state was the only such solution. In fact, I think that there were many experiments in how to deal with that problem, other visions of governance that we miss if we focus too hard on the teleological development of the modern state. My colleague Mark Peterson, for instance, is writing a book about what he calls the city-state of Boston, a vision of home rule in New England, which for more than 2 centuries challenged the hegemony of first the British Empire and then the United States. Phil Withington has recently shown more generally how the cities of early modern England were themselves experiments in extra-state governance. The plantation societies of the 17th century Caribbean might be seen as another vision, as indeed might the world of mercantile exchange in the 17th century maritime Atlantic basin. So those are all other visions. What I want to stress is that those visions are not necessarily dead ends. They're not necessarily things that didn't produce important consequences, even if they are not the same as the modern state. That is, we don't need to not study them because they were dead ends in history. They might give us interesting things to talk about. And here I want to come back to the subject of religion and my failure yesterday to convince the modernists here that early modern issues of religion and the state, which have nothing to do with secularization, might nonetheless be more than fossils and might be helpful for thinking about the late modern period and all of your work on the state. In particular, I've been writing a lot recently about what we might call Puritan political theory. Many Puritans rejected the civil parish system at the heart of early modern governance and believed it was essentially tyrannical, since, as Thomas Goodwin put it, each single congregation is endowed with a charter to be a body politic of Christ. Individual members of congregations were, of course, subject to the civil state, but the congregation as a whole was something like an autonomous republic, electing its own leaders and disciplining its own members without outside interference. Now, in the eyes of their detractors, this rejection of external authority made Puritans dangerously ungovernable, the very antithesis of the modern state. In their own eyes, however, this made Puritans the only truly governed subjects, since unlike the parishes, which promiscuously accepted all manner of drunkards, adulterers, and idolaters as full members in civil affairs, the Puritan congregations were exclusive bodies that actively purged themselves of sinners, leaving behind a body capable, unlike England, of virtuous self-government. In the Congregationalist system, then, we can see an alternative solution to the problem of governing the deracinated modern subject, a voluntarist solution. Those who sought and obtained membership invented new technologies of governance for themselves, technologies built around meetings, debates, and votes. This sort of Puritan voluntarism, of course, was not a dead end in history. It arguably had as much impact on the modern world as the new Leviathan of the British state. But if we focus our analysis of the state in British history solely on the origins of the modern state, we miss the fact that these issues of ecclesiology were central to the subject of the state in the early modern period, even if they weren't later. Religion and the state was, in fact, where much of the action was in the 17th century. And even if that action migrated later to other spheres, something like a continuous history of the early modern sphere of religion and the state can nonetheless be written, even if its sequels, even if where it went lies outside the subject of the state. So this is not a claim that modernity doesn't matter. It's also not a claim that we ought to study everything in the past with sort of equal interest without reference to whether it ended up mattering for the future. Rather, it's a suggestion that there are a lot of important subjects that we miss if we take the origin of the modern state as our question, and those aspects are not all dead ends or roads not taken. They may not be part of the state today, but they were part of the early modern state, or at least early modern thinking about the state, and they are also unquestionably part of modernity.
So we decided over lunch that the next instantiation of this conference would be in London, but also be about empire. So I decided that I might as well actually talk about the next conference rather than this one. As you can expect, while you all thought I was watching Cal get killed by Oregon, I was actually trying to come up with some ideas about linking the two conferences. So England became an imperial state in the 1650s. This statement implies a conceptual distinction between having an empire and being an empire. English kings had an empire in the 13th and 15th centuries in the sense that they held and governed possessions outside of England proper. James I and Charles I had an empire in North America even before the dissolution of the Virginia Company. They held directly or indirectly overseas possessions. But being an empire, or more precisely an imperial state, is something entirely different, I think. It involves creating a set of institutions for governing the empire. More than that, it meant governing the empire and managing its trade integral. It made governing the empire and managing its trade integral to the very being of the English state. From the 1650s onwards, all English politics, or British politics, broadly defined, was in some sense imperial politics. Now, I had a section about the British question which I've excised, so there it is. That's why I'm fudging it here. My claim that the English state took a fundamental turn in the 1650s echoes earlier claims, not yesterday, made, but elsewhere, advanced by Mike Braddock. Like Braddock, I see the development of the Council of Trade and the passage of the 1651 Navigation Act as key moments in which the English state, as opposed to the English crown or the person of an English monarch, took primary control over regulating an empire. The Western design, it seems to me, was the first moment in which the English state self-consciously sought to gain an overseas possession, even if it ultimately took control over a possession other than the one it intended to seize. A very different English government seized New Amsterdam in 1664. Like Braddock, I associate this radical new departure with military revolution of the mid-17th century, the increased capacity of the English army, and the creation of a professional navy. But I want to push this story much farther chronologically than Mike did did in his book. After the Restoration, Charles II continued to devote a great deal of energy to colonial settlement, governance, and regulation. But the committees and councils which dealt with colonial affairs were once again placed inside as offshoots of the Privy Council, so it became once again household government. They functioned in state-like ways, but they were in fact subject to the king, so it was a reversion away from an imperial state. But in 1696, all that changed when Parliament sanctioned the Board of Trade, the body which would oversee not only imperial governance, but commercial regulation through much of the 18th century. And unlike Braddock, I think this observation creates real interpretive problems for those who describe an 18th century Atlantic empire in which institutions mattered little until the 1760s, or who believe that there was a largely hegemonic ideological conception of the 18th century. That is, I have little patience with a historian who can claim that the single dominant conception of the British Empire in the 18th century was that it was Protestant, commercial, maritime, and free. I have no idea who would have said such a ridiculous thing, but I have little patience where such a person exists. No, it wasn't. No, fair enough. No, fair enough. I do not accuse you of this. I just accuse you of being insufficiently critical of this.
Sister institution, let us say.
Oh, not our sister institution. We have no brethren there. The fact that England became an empire, that the English state took over imperial governance and commercial regulation, meant that English politics from that time forward would always be in great measure about imperial affairs in one way or another. Empire was not, as Kathleen Wilson has maintained, merely the issue of the opposition in the 18th century. Instead, from the 1680s through the American Revolution and beyond, English party politics, British party politics, coalesced around competing visions of empire. These competing visions were expressed in different ways at different moments and at different levels of society. But there was an ideological, social, and structural continuity that held these discussions together. Now, let me stipulate a few things that I am implying in this conceptualization before elaborating what I mean by these competing ideologies and politics of empire. First, I reject the notion that the center ever imposed anything on the periphery. I reject this not because all state power is negotiated, and I think Krista and Mike in their different ways have disposed of that interesting concept. This is a banal observation and demands the question, how much does the state have to negotiate at one point in time versus another? I reject the center-periphery conceptualization because that conceptualization is itself political. Throughout the late 17th and 18th centuries, those in the colonies in the West Indies and North America, and to some extent in India, worked hand in hand with allies in England and Britain to advance their agendas. The reverse was also true. Merchants, politicians, clerics in England sought out and worked with allies in Barbados, Jamaica, New York, and obviously Glasgow and Canada to advance their agendas. The subservience of the colony to the metropole was the ideological agenda of the Tories. And the fact that we accept this distinction between the metropole and the periphery is the fact that we have internalized a Tory rhetoric about the empire, who in fact wrote imperial history in the first generation and adopted it as normal. This strikes me as a political acceptance, which I don't want to accept. Too much scholarship has unthinkingly reproduced that conceptual formation. Although I'm so depressed with the Cal score, I might accept it. Second, it strikes me that the Board of Trade structured discourse about empire. And here, the point I'm making is that the Board of Trade invited petitions about commercial and imperial affairs, commercial and not necessarily overseas things. Tens of thousands of people obliged, creating transatlantic and global links. And it strikes me that what this meant was that the Board of Trade itself became the site of political contestation, not only at the center, not only in London, but in Jamaica, in Glasgow, etc., that it structured these communities to compete with the Board of Trade, and the Board of Trade fights over the Board of Trade itself became political. So who got on the Board of Trade, what the Board of Trade could do, these were the sites of huge political fights throughout the late 17th and 18th century. This is just to go so far to show that discourses matter quite a lot, but discourses matter and are put into action by structures, that one cannot study discourse absent structures. From at least the early 17th century, the English had two competing imperial agendas. The first ideological program, advocated by folks such as Walter Raleigh and Thomas Munn in the early 17th century, and by Tories in the later 17th and early 18th century, and the group James Fawn has called Neo-Tories from the 1760s onwards, had a particular political and political economic program. This group understood the world's resources to be finite and limited by land. They therefore demanded an expansive and self-financing territorial empire. From the 1620s onwards, they dreamed of territorial empire in India. In 1713, they insisted on territorial concessions. Gibraltar, Nova Scotia, Buenos Aires, which they failed to gain, but they actually negotiated for possession of in 1713, and the key tool of territorial empire, the asiento, to sell slaves to Spanish America. The Tory version of territorial empire required an authoritarian and repressive political regime in the colonies. Since they understood the colonies to be subservient to the metropole, a description of the imperial situation perpetuated in the vast majority of writings about the empire in colonial North America, the goal was necessarily to make the colonies pay for themselves and return economic benefit to Britain or England. The Whigs advanced an alternative vision of empire. They believed that the world's economic resources were potentially infinite. For these Whigs, manufacturing was the key to England's economic future. Extra-European possessions were useful insofar as they could provide new manufactures and provide new markets for British-English manufacturers when Britain's rivals sought to close European markets, as they did periodically from the 1660s right straight through the continental system. In the view of the Whigs, New England, which the Tories always viewed as expendable, another reason why I don't like the Tories, was valuable as a potential shipbuilding center. So the Whigs were furious that in 1713 the Tory government had sacrificed trading privileges in Spanish America in favor of territorial possessions. In the 1760s and 1770s, it was the self-styled old Whigs like Benjamin Franklin, Price, Priestley, John Wilkes, Pitt the Elder, and Payne who denounced the rigid separation of metropole and colony. They wanted instead, as would Adam Smith and Thomas Pownall, a greater degree of imperial integration, both economic and political. Political contestation rather than political consensus characterized the English-British imperial state. There was no period of salutary neglect or imperial indifference, and something imagined by Americanists so as not to have to study British history before the 1760s. This was true, British politics from the 1650s onward was imperial politics. This was true for economic lobbies, as Heather Welland has shown, for ecclesiastical politics, as Brent Sirota has shown, for inheritance practices, as Alice Wolfram has shown, for Indian affairs, as James Vaughan has shown, and for the debates over Scottish improvement, as Frederick Janssen has shown. There was no period of imperial indifference or salutary neglect. The long 18th century was an age of party political contestation over control of the English-British imperial state. That from the beginning there was party political tension between defenders of a more authoritarian and territorial empire on the one hand and promoters of a manufacturing, commercial, and integrative empire on the other suggests that the conventional periodization of imperial history needs to be discarded. It is wrong. There was no mystical epistemic shift from a commercial, liberty-loving Atlantic First British Empire to an authoritarian, eastward-looking Second British Empire. The two models of empire were centrally present from the moment that Britain became an imperial state in the 1650s. Modern British historians could not ignore the early modern period in the smug belief that something fundamental had changed. All of this suggests that in one sense the English-British imperial state was not precocious. Clearly, Spain, Portugal, and France had imperial states earlier than Britain. What was unusual about England-Britain, though this was also true of the Dutch Republic in the early modern period, was that imperial policy was the stuff of party politics. In Spain and in Portugal, imperial policies were promulgated from the imperial center. What internal debate there was contained within the court. The criticisms of the arbitristas, for example, trenchant and sophisticated though they were, circulated in manuscript among court factions. The same pattern was true of France under the Ancien regime. Interestingly, after the Revolution, the new French Empire was very much the subject of party contestation. One is left to wonder whether empires forged in the crucible of party conflict were more likely to leave troublesome legacies that would visit the European center after their demise than those in which the empire was shaped along a consistent, if evolving, set of principles. That's it.
Let me begin by saying I cannot read at supersonic speed.
That was subsonic?
I heard a boom here and there, but okay. Now, when was the state? I think my talk will be fairly complimentary, but I'll challenge you on a few points here. One possible boundary between the early modern and the modern state that I see is the 18th century. And we haven't talked enough about the 18th century so far, so I'll try to make amends. At first I was tempted to ask, did the state have an enlightenment? But that seemed to reify both the state and the Enlightenment. So I pulled back from that, and instead I will ask about expertise. place the history of state formation in the history of expertise in the 18th century. This involves a host of related questions. What happens when state actors invoke scientific authority to legitimate political actions? Does scientific expertise offer a peculiarly modern form of legitimation for the state? What do we mean by it, of course? If it is a distinctly modern phenomenon, when did it emerge in full force? And so forth. So what I'm going to do is offer just 2 or 3 little case studies of different kinds of experts running around in the 18th century and try to show how they may have changed the game of politics, or at least tried to change, because I think most of their projects actually failed. In the 18th century, then, I want to single out 3, maybe 4 different groups: natural historians, excisemen, political economists, and possibly antiquarians, although I will concede they're the odd man out. In all these cases, I think we're dealing with a category of authority distinct from the legal and religious spheres. We can talk about Adam Smith and jurisprudence, but I would still maintain that basic distinction. I use the term here expert office holder or advisor to office holders to emphasize agency in a qualified sense, to emphasize a certain distance between knowledge and its institutional context. Think of expert testimony in Parliament, for example, or intellectual authorities like Adam Smith, who had good political connections. Adam Smith dispensed economic advice to leading politicians like Henry Dundas, but when he finally achieved an office as a Commissioner of Customs in Scotland, he did not choose to use it as a pedestal to launch a program of political reform. And it would have been a little awkward, right? Now, in all these cases, expertise involved a pretense of political neutrality. Obey because we know better. Our knowledge is superior to yours and above politics because it conforms to natural standards. Quick example, Adam Smith invokes nature or the natural something like 260 times in The Wealth of Nations. And it doesn't just simply mean I'm right. It has specific ecological, environmental, agricultural context that we can talk about. Now, this pretense of objectivity was vulnerable to counterclaims. One could play the game of politics within the game of knowledge. Hence, the appeal to expertise opened up a new arena of political contestation. That's how I see the 18th century, a series of rival forms of expertise, butting heads. And often, the clashes come down to different rival interpretations of nature, what nature can do for you. Finally, a crucial question here is when scientific expertise becomes a routine resort of political actors. Right? I'm sure we can find earlier examples than the 18th century, but for instance, if we compare the debates on economic trade issues from the early 1700s with those in the 1820s, I'm sure you're going to notice a fundamental change, right, in economic discourse. That's what I'm talking about. All right. I, again, apologize for not reading as quickly as my colleague, but I'm doing my best. Now, let me try to offer up, to clarify the difference, let me try to offer up a brief notion of what I think early modern expertise might have been about. In the most fundamental sense, I take it to mean the mastery of some aspect of the natural or social world possessed by a privileged minority, a knowledge which, by definition, could not be reduced to a few rules in a textbook, but remained at least in part a tacit body of knowledge embodied in skills of the hand and the eye, earned by long experience. And in the 18th century, they would have called this useful knowledge. And you can see that in Wedgwood's manufacturing practice. You can see it in Norfolk farming, down to artisanal skills, right? It's everywhere. But something different happens in the 18th century, I think, too. And here, I will use the case of William Ashworth's wonderful, wonderful work on the excise from a few years back. And I would also like to bring your attention, if you haven't read Lorraine Daston and Peter Gallison's a fantastic book about the history of the forms of objectivity. I highly recommend it. Now, the excise on spirits was, socially speaking, an explosive, not to say a flammable matter. Disputes between excisemen and merchants raged over the correct method of measuring the alcohol content in the excise on brandy. In the 1720s, the London instrument maker John Clarke devised an instrument of copper and brass using weights to determine alcohol content adjusted for temperature. Clarke's hydrometer came into widespread use by excisemen in the 1730s. William Ashworth, I think, draws a very interesting conclusion from this shift, this turn to instruments. He says, the hydrometer was part of a new version of expertise based on, quote, systematic procedures, an emphasis on instrumentation, anonymity, and rigorous internal and external methods of surveying. Furthermore, socially speaking, we're moving from a culture of unconstrained judgment to one of rule-bound procedures. Merchant, industrial, and civil suspicion of state defined devices to measure commodities that had to be overcome by impersonal method. In other words, don't trust us. Trust our procedures and instruments. And I realize Smith's Wealth of Nations isn't quite a kind of hydrometer, but political economy functions along very similar lines. Now, if I can take another 2 minutes, just to flesh out the case for rival expertise. Lots of intellectual historians have noticed that Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations didn't exactly make a big splash in the political community right away. It took a while. Some would date the wider recognition of it to the 1790s. Why so long? Well, one reason is that there was a rival form of economic expertise in this exact moment and time. From 1778 onwards, the Lincolnshire landowner Sir Joseph Banks gained control of Kew Botanic Gardens outside London, forging it into a research station and ecological hub for plant transfers from one end of the empire to the other. This is, in other words, one of the Tory politicians Steve was mentioning earlier. He's a peculiar kind of politician, a network builder. Thanks to royal patronage and close ties with a succession of cabinets, Banks established a neo-mercantilist strategy for strengthening the empire during the crises of the American and French War. His most ambitious project, which wasn't actually realized in his lifetime, was to transfer tea from China to India to diversify Indian ecology and make the colony more profitable. He also planned out the ecological colonization of New South Wales. And I think that's the first case of someone in the metropole trying to mastermind the ecological biota of a colony in advance. He was also involved with the Board of Agriculture, launched in 1793. Now, I take the Board of Agriculture to have been in the business of trying to make an inventory of the resources of Britain, the agrarian resources. And in fact, I think what they're really up to is to come up with the national carrying capacity of the British nation in wartime. So it's a way of strengthening the argument for Corn Laws. It's obviously the context for Malthus, although they're more optimistic than Malthus on many points. Now, I don't have time to do this, but what happens in the early 19th century is that these two forms of expertise go to war in the colonial laboratory of Bengal over the question of famine relief. Smith says, famines are political. They're not caused by drought. Let the market loose and the population will be fine. The natural historians say, we know nature. Nature sometimes can get disrupted. That's the monsoon cycle, the periodical droughts. Let us tell you, meaning the colonial state, about nature. And so they propose schemes, water tanks, imitating the Mughals, with irrigation systems and so forth. And then there's a battle. There's basically a battle for the attention of the colonial administration that goes on throughout the 19th century. So that I hope that gives you a little sense of the flavor of the politics of expertise and what happens when you try to occlude conventional politics with the appeal to nature.
Terrific, thank you. I've been anxious all weekend because I didn't take Ethan's advice a week ago and write something. So I have no text to read from. So I certainly won't be rapid, and I probably won't be fluid. But I'll do my best, and I'm going to begin on a hopefully a fluent nature, because I'm going to read somebody else. I'm going to read a extract from Sidney Webb's response to Herbert Spencer's Man versus the State in 1884, in which he tries to set out the nature of the state in the late 19th century. And it's really a catalogue of the series of actions that the state is involved in at that moment. The state, he says, now carries on for itself in some part or another of these islands the post office, telegraphs, carriage of small commodities, coinage, surveys, the regulation of the currency and note issue, the provision of weights and measures, the making, sweeping, lighting and repairing of streets, roads and bridges, life insurance, the grants of annuities, shipbuilding, stockbroking, banking, farming and money lending. It provides for many thousands of us from birth to burial, midwifery, nursery, education, board and lodging, vaccination, medical attendance, medicine, public worship, amusements, internment. It furnishes and maintains its own museums, parks, art galleries, libraries, concert halls, roads, streets, bridges, markets, slaughterhouses, fire engines, lighthouses, pilots, ferries, surf boats, steam tugs, lifeboats, cemeteries, public baths, wash houses, pounds, harbours, piers, wharfs, hospitals, dispensaries, gasworks, waterworks, tramways, telegraph cables, allotments, cow meadows, artisans' dwellings, schools, churches and reading rooms. That's quite a long sentence. It carries on and publishes its own researches in geology, meteorology, statistics, zoology, geography and even theology. In our colonies, and this is a telling sentence, in our colonies the English government further allows and encourages the communities to provide for themselves railways, canals, pawnbroking, theatres, forestry, farming, irrigation, leper villages, casinos, bathing establishments, immigration, and to deal in ballast, quinine, opium, salt and whatnot. Besides its direct supervision of private enterprise, the state now registers, inspects and controls nearly all the industrial functions which it has not yet absorbed. In addition to births, marriages and deaths and electors, the state registers all solicitors, barristers, notaries, there's going to be another long sentence, patent agents, brokers, newspaper proprietors, playing card makers, brewers, bankers, seamen, captains, mates, doctors, cabmen, hawkers, pawnbrokers, tobacconists, distillers, plate dealers, game dealers, all insurance companies, friendly societies, endowed schools and charities, limited companies, lands, houses, deeds, bills of sales, compositions, ships, arms, dogs, cabs, omnibuses, books, plays, pamphlets, newspapers, raw cotton movements, trademarks and patents, lodging houses, public houses, refreshment houses, theatres, music halls, places of worship, elementary schools and dancing rooms. There's another whole page of this, which I'm going to spare you from reading. The point that I'm trying to make here by reading, I think there are a couple of points that I could make in reading this. The first is, it's interesting to one measure of when the state becomes modern, if indeed that is a useful term, and in some ways I'm in total sympathy with Ethan that that might not be the most useful way of thinking about the state. But insofar as we are thinking about it, one important measure would be to think about how it is that contemporaries themselves observe the transformation of state structures. And it seems to me that Webb would be an important place to start. You could go back to Cobbett and Wade in the early 19th century, but there's a substantive difference in terms of the scale, I think, when we get, by the time we get to Sidney Webb. So this raises, of course, immediately the definitional question and returns us to the infamous Braddock Model. So I have two things to say about this. First is that I don't believe that the state is just about the possession, competition and use of political power from officers. I don't think it's possible to separate out the question of power from its mode of operations. So I'm not necessarily talking about the functions of the state here, but its mode of operation. It's not just what the state does that changes dramatically over time, but rather how it does it. And here I'm going to repeat, I think, many of the things that Frederick has already said. And I believe this is the best way in which we can track changes in state formation over time. Questions of its shape, the mode of its operation, and its legitimation over time. Now, I'm not going to try and find a big bang moment of the arrival of the modern state, but I am going to flesh out some of those characteristics that I think are distinctly modern. And in many ways, what I'm saying here is, I'm not trying to say that many of these things weren't anticipated or had their origins in the 17th or 18th centuries. I'm basically saying, look, mine's bigger and more complex than yours. So the first thing would be to say that the period from 17, and this is very like Ethan, I'm going back to demographics. The period from 1750 to 1900 is one in which the complexity and size of populations becomes dramatically different. So between 1750 and 1900, the population of England and Wales rises from 7 million to 37 million. 13% of that population is urban in 1750, 80% of it is urban by 1900. By 1920, the British Empire covers 13 million square miles and over 450 million people as best they know. Okay, this is a massive, massive territorial reach and an infinitely complex and effectively new population that the state is having to grapple with. So I think the fundamental question and problem for the modern state is how it governs strangers over great distances. Okay? So in here, and again, I'm returning to Weber in many ways here, I'm interested in the transformation of the nature of state's authority, the way in which legitimacy ceases to come from divine or personal or charismatic sources to more abstract and bureaucratic and anonymous forms of authority, and abstract systems capable of governing strangers over a distance. Now, I want to emphasize immediately that I think that this is a highly uneven process, both territorially and socially. What I described yesterday is the vertical and horizontal. This is certainly no linear process, and I believe also, critically, that this is a process that is mirrored in civil society itself. And here I refer to Penny Ismay's works on friendly societies, where you have precisely this transformation in terms of the organization of friendly societies themselves, relying first of all on face-to-face relationships, and then increasingly trying to deal with how it is that they recognize and have friendly relations with strangers, ending up in a statistical basis and regulation by the state. So how is this achieved? Well, I think Frederick's totally right. It's achieved by new forms of expertise and new forms of bureaucratic authority that present themselves as disinterested. Now, critically, a central role in this process would have to go to the process of civil service reform in Britain in the 19th century. The attempt to eradicate government office from charges of old corruption and of interest. And here we can see that process happening in the East India Company from after the Hastings trials. We see it in the Northcote Trevelyan reforms. And critically, I think we actually see it in the material development of Whitehall itself. I remind you that the 19th century is the moment in which Whitehall takes its current, very concrete form. All of those offices are built and refashioned in the 19th century, and I'll say a little more about that in a moment. And I just want to also flag that this is clearly and centrally an imperial process as well. And here I could refer to lots of people in this room, to the work of Riyadh on the regulation of customary marriages, to the work of Andrew on the Imperial War Graves Commission, to Caroline's work on refugees and the incorporation of the empire into a system of providing refuge, to Jeff Shah's work on the protection of flora and fauna across the empire, and to Carrie Ritter's work on the imperial census. Okay, I clearly don't have time to go into all of this, so I'm just trying to give a shout out to people in the room whose work is terrific and you should talk to about this stuff further. Secondly, clearly involved in this process is an extension of the reach of the state, both geographically and socially, through the new agencies and offices and systems of standardization and regulation and inspection that these new forms of expertise require. And I could give lots of, I don't have lots of, I mean, I do have lots of empirical examples, but I don't have time to go into that. I think Webb, in a way, does that work for me quite nicely. What I am going to suggest is that this process fundamentally is premised upon a major epistemological move, which is the division, the divvying up of distinct domains of statecraft. And I think that an absolutely characteristic element of the modern state is that you have the separation of questions of the military, economy, society, politics, and culture. And here, I think, that is a substantive difference to the debates that Steve is talking about earlier. And each of those areas, and this is why it's not a linear story of development, each of these areas require and demand different forms of intervention, different forms of and different agencies acting upon them. That is to say that they're developing with different rhythms and different momentums over time. I forget if this is my third or my fourth point, but whichever point it is. I'm suggesting, and here I'm coming out as the old unreconstructed Foucauldian that I am, that the justification of intervention in these areas, if you like, the legitimacy of the state increasingly becomes the security of the population. That becomes the new basis around which government and statecraft is organized, and that it happens and is applied, again, very differently in these different areas. But I want to emphasize that the question of security is one which is economic, political, and social and cultural all at the same time. Clearly, the definition of that how it is that security is defined, is a highly contested concept. It's contested all the time by political groups across the empire. Okay, there's no settled definition of what type of security the state should provide. This is something in which civil society across the empire is fundamentally engaged in. And so therefore, here we have a link to the critical expansion of the representative apparatus of politics. That matters. It matters that more and more people get the chance in Britain domestically to be able to have a say on how it is that security should be defined. This is basically the reason why we have the emergence of the welfare state. Okay? And it's also, I think, a fundamental, foundational claim of colonial nationalists that imperial government does not provide security in any of these areas. So, I'm coming to an end, I promise you. I want to finish up. I think I'm finishing up. Yes, I am, almost. The argument, then, is basically that the state is not just a leviathan centred upon Whitehall, but a system of dispersed authorities and agencies, of diverse administrative practices that Webb listed exhaustively. And each of those mobilized a quite different group of social actors. A different set of social relations were constituted in the practice of statecraft. And each of these required constant negotiation and adaptation. Okay, it's a constant and unending process. Now, I think that this allows us to ask a critical question, which is how do these very novel practices and systems of governing at a distance become naturalized and trusted? Okay, how is it that we come to trust what appears to be the now new and natural forms of state operation? And trust is really, I think, a central term here. And I think it's one that helps us reframe the question of legitimacy as not simply just a political and ideological one, but as a social one. And I'm here interested in trying to sort of recuperate a view of the state as a socially embedded institution. I'll finish up by coming back a little to the question of periodization. I want to emphasize to end that I don't think that there's a big bang moment of arrival. I'm not interested in being able to say, you know, that the modern state arrives in 1780 or 1750 or 1830. Okay? I don't think that that really matters. I think that what is important is the processes that I'm talking about and the unevenness of their development. So I'll give you some very quick examples. Bureaucratic authority clearly remains centrally wedded to views of class and caste. And really the caste view is the British view, is of the sort of established ruling class in Britain. I'm thinking of Vincent's work on secrecy and the culture of the gentleman in the new, in the new civil service, but you could think of native princes and the whole I can't say that word. The whole variety of forms of government that exist across the empire. Second point is that these standardized systems of intervention and regulation and inspection occur at very different rates and with very varied levels of success across these different domains. Okay, some of them work, some of them don't. Okay, weights and measures. Imperial weights and measures come in 1828. Inspection comes in 1878. But, you know, still deep into the 20th century, they're dealing with different local weights and measures being used internally within Britain, to say nothing of across the imperial state. And finally, I want to make the point that the promise of security, the promise of the state to provide security to the population, varies enormously in terms of the purchase of civil society, the engagement of civil society in its ability to define what that definition is. So we return again to the discussion that we had this morning of who counts at home, who counts abroad, whether a colony is one of conquest or of settlement, how sovereignty is claimed, how government is enacted in a whole variety of ways. So it's a complex mess, okay? It's not a linear story, it's an uneven process, but nonetheless, there is a general process, I think, which holds true for what I will describe as the modern period. Thank you. So I really am not in a position to, or maybe I am. I mean, I guess there are actually quite a lot of commonalities in what we say.
Well, I mean, it struck me listening to all of this, coming back to what you had said in your opening remarks, that there seems to be a revolution in government in every period.
Right.
And listening, I don't think that that's a historiographical sort of oddity based on us all trying to show that our periods are interesting. It sounds like it's actually real. And that brings up a question of why that's so, right? How is it that you have seemingly this constant process of evolution, if not revolution, in government since the 15th century? You know, one thing I just scribbled down is that, listening to your remarks, you know, it sounds like government is a complex, right, by definition. And the thing about complexes, they grow by accrual. So government gets more complex and thus gets to be more government, right, by its very nature of accruing all of these things to it. And so that might account for what seems to be the sort of teleological, always bigger, always better narrative that we're presenting. It accrues differently in different ways, different things, but it seems always to be picking up things that had previously been outside government, now they're inside government.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that the important qualification that you gave us was to remember about the dead ends, about the persistence and endurance of other seemingly non-modern forms of authority, and I think that absolutely continues all the way into the 20th century. I'm less happy with a picture of evolution. I guess I'm
punctuated equilibrium.
Maybe.
Can I just sort of jump in? There's two points that I want to make. Well, one is that just sort of quickly about Ethan's initial comments. I'm very sympathetic to what you say about Puritanism, and I'm very sympathetic because it shows how sociologists can be terribly sophisticated, because it does strike me that you've reproduced Phil Gorski's argument of the disciplinary revolution.
Gorski's great.
No, but I think that's extremely important because it sort of speaks to Frank's question about whether sociologists can actually think about the past usefully or not. But I do think, I think it's an important point that you make, and I'm sort of endorse that there's a broader comparative region play. But the second point is, I guess I want to sort of go back. I mean, far be it from me to defend anything that Mike says, since he clearly won't criticize people who teach at Harvard, which is a deeply problematic thing. But it does strike me that Mike's notion, I do think not so much of what he said yesterday, but I do think sort of centrally in the book about the state is that there is some fundamental difference between what's going on in the 16th century and what's going on by the later 17th century. And I do think I think that one can talk about significant moments of state improvement without saying that they're all equal and they're all punctuated equilibrium. And I sort of believe that there is this fundamental transformation which happens in late 17th and early 18th centuries. And I think if you actually went through Webb's list and compared it to chapter 4 of my book, you'd see my more recent book, how many of these things that Webb, obviously not tramways, but a good number of the things that actually he lists are precisely the sorts of things that the state is getting involved in regulating and producing in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. And I think that the point that Frederick is making is not that there's a sort of fundamental sea change in the 18th century, but that this question of expertise becomes elaborated in new ways, which leads to sort of new tests and elaborate. So I guess I would want to sort of talk about differentiate big changes and significant but other changes. And I think the point that in some ways you and I are in agreement about the sort of imperial state being breaking down these face-to-face communities. And it does strike me that Lindsay O'Neill's doctoral dissertation shows this breaking apart. It's when you get this sort of imperial state that there's this desire to keep a face-to-face community going, and it can't work, and it breaks apart, and that breaks apart, according to her anyway, precisely over the course of the 17th century. And one last thing that I just wanted to say is I think this issue of the notion of the state as promoting security is one possible model. It strikes me that there's a contested model. And the contested model, I guess I would sort of put improvement, the state as sort of improving. You could use, this is one way of describing it. And it strikes me as kind of, or one way of thinking about it is the Bush model of the state versus the Obama model of the state. That is to say, you've described and defended the Bush, no, you're a defender of the Bush model, unsurprisingly, really unsurprisingly, where what the state is trying to do is just to protect the security of the lives of these people. So you go out, the key thing is to go out after terrorists. Whereas it does strike me that the sort of Obama model is you try to improve the lives of a variety of people. Or one could say it's the Hobbes. What?
It's called social security.
Well, but it's more than that. It's more than that. It's a desire to sort of improve. There's improvement is the rhetoric, as opposed, and I see the sort of distinction between a sort of Hobbesian view of the state versus a Lockean view of the state.
Can I come back to the dead end issue, because I'm really interested in that. I too see a sort of demographic basis to my argument about delayed enlightenment. And And I came to this realization by reading Tony Wrigley's work on the transition from the advanced organic economy, he calls it, right, to the mineral energy economy of industrial modernity. And he points out, and I think this is incredibly revealing, that all the way from Smith through Malthus up to Mill, these guys are really not optimistic about the prospects of improvement. They think that Britain will, despite its wealth and riches, will reach a stationary state fairly soon, right? I mean, Mill positively wants it to do so, right? But my point would be that natural history, neo-Tory natural history of the 1790s and early 19th century is trying to cope with that situation, with demographic pressure, with ecological strain, and it's coming up with a completely, from our point of view, a completely crazy idea that natural history is a sort of alchemical science that will unleash diversify life forms, right? And I've found claims in the 1780s and 90s that they think England is running out of coal. There's one mineralogist who says England has about 30 to 40 years of coal left in 1789. So that's why you want to go with Bengal and natural history, right? But this is, what I would stress is this is a dead end, but it's one that has its own intrinsic rationality, right? It's a kind of alternative modernity, if you like.
I mean, I was thinking about the 18th century. I was thinking about Joanna Innes's work, especially her more, both her earlier work on prisons and her more recent work on the sort of social origins of government policy, and how, you know, her version of the 18th century. And I wanted her to be here. I invited her to be here, but. You know, her version of the 18th century as this sort of hybrid shows, I think, a lot of the things that don't end up being central to the modern state, but nonetheless end up being central to the modern condition, right? So that the focus on the state, while, you know, salutary, and of course the state is the dominant technology of modernity, right? There are all of these other things that are present earlier that float through in really significant ways, and that the tensions that James is talking about, these divergent sort of versions of divergent interests or divergent claims to the common good, right, are in, you can sort of see as the ghosts of these earlier versions of what the state itself might be.
We should open it up to the floor to get some contention going here. Oh, have we got the microphone? So Chris and then Jordana, were you asking her? Yeah? So Chris and then Jordana? Chris is in the check shirt.
I don't know if I can provide contention. But,
Jordana then.
It seems that in each of these cases of expansion of the state that you four have talked about, there's an expansion of politics that kind of necessitates that, and Ethan talked most explicitly about that the Reformation creates political ideology through religious difference. In the 1650s, we have political difference over empire. We have these political differences over different kinds of expertise, and then maybe slightly more implicitly in James' remarks, we have political differences over class issues, I guess, with the welfare state, and that perhaps fits very nicely with the sort of demographic and social changes that you've also talked about, maybe. What I want to question, though, is, especially James, you talked about the 19th and 20th century state dealing with a much bigger, right, more people, more geographical reach, which is undoubtedly true. But at the same time, isn't it true that in the 17th century state, there were parts of the empire that were much farther away in sort of communication terms than any part of the empire in the 20th century. So there seems to be a tension between, yes, things are getting bigger and more complicated, but there are also sort of technologies that can collapse those differences. So I don't know if that rings any bells with anyone.
Well, do you want me to, are we going to do it, Chris? Okay. I think that's a great point, Chris, and in many ways I think it's that those difficulties and problems of governing at a distance that is generative of these new systems of these new systems of government. So I think it's certainly a problem generated not just by imperialism, but importantly by imperialism.
Can I say something very briefly about this demographic pressure stuff? I think,
No,
I suppose, let me just say, I mean, it does strike me that this is a kind of not terribly sophisticated proposition, and let me give you one example. If Mike is at all right, that I mean, and you know, but let's raise the improbable assumption that Mike Braddock has said something useful in his career, and I raise this as an improbable assumption. If he's right, that means that this sort of transformation and elaboration of the state happens in the period of population stasis. In the late 17th century, and it strikes me that well, I mean, I am in the process of writing with your former supervisor a piece about how we've done it before, we'll do it again if we drink enough, and we have been, but our I mean the view that the demography, it strikes me the sort of emphasis on demography, while has produced extremely useful data, has created some somewhat preposterous notions about the relationship between demography and institutional change. And I will call you to, I mean, to speak of sort of Tony Wrigley's article, it will be useful if you read Joel Mokir's book, which is coming out next month, about the relationship between this organic economy. It strikes me that Joel, in a 10 vitriolic pages, makes one think why anybody would ever read Tony Wrigley on the Industrial Revolution.
Well, we'll all look forward to that then. Jordan.
What?
Well, my question was actually about contention, and I was very interested in this idea that James and Frederick brought up about the link between statecraft and expertise, but it seemed like the main form of contention that you were both describing is really between rival forms of expertise, right? That there's sort of experts set against experts, and they set up different domains of authority for themselves, which sometimes compete with one another. You're already shaking your head, Frederick, so I know you're going to answer this. But I was wondering if there's also the basis, if part of the basis for new forms of statecraft is also in a critique of expertise, and from where does that critique come, if so? That is, there are competing forms of expertise, but there are also people who are critical of the idea of expertise itself as a form of governance. And who are some of those players in the period that you're talking about, and why are they critical of it? What's their alternate?
Can I go with the first part of it, and you can, well, you can do whichever part you want. No, I would really stress very much that this is not a matter of talking heads sort of floating around in a vacuum, and so it's not some sort of vulgar Foucauldianism I'm talking about. I'm talking about capturing colonial patronage such that you can embark on massive projects of either social engineering by introducing your notion of a market, or hydraulic engineering with irrigation and so forth, right? And I wanted to, I forgot to stress something in my talk that I'll mention now. I don't have quite the numbers. Maybe Riyadh or James know the numbers for the famine victims of British India between 1770 and 1943. I would venture to say they're in the tens of millions.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And if one, I mean, to the extent that one attributes those deaths to the British imperial state, you've got a case for the most massive case of state violence in the history of the British Empire, far outnumbering any war, right? So the stakes are very real.
Could I get in on this question of expertise? Because I'm sorry that we're dominating, but I don't want to claim that there's nothing new under the sun. I don't want to claim that change over time isn't the crucial aspect of all this. Nonetheless, let me tell you a story. This is out of Jacques Le Goff, the French medievalist. A judicial duel is to be fought circa 1200, and I'm going to get some of the details wrong. The duel is scheduled, and the magistrate is overseeing it at 7 in the morning. 8 o'clock in the morning rolls around, and one of the parties has not yet appeared, and that hour would mean legally that he had forfeited the case, right? The question is raised, however, whether it is really 8 o'clock. No one locally has any technology with which to tell. So a monk is called in from the nearby monastery who measures as best he can, I think he probably just eyeballs the position of the sun, and determines at a certain point that yes, indeed, an hour has passed and that the duel has been forfeited. Right? It is not I mean, A, this means expertise matters earlier, but B, it means it's not a coincidence that these experts of the 18th and 19th century are referred to as the new priesthood. Right? That to the extent that expertise over the common good and over what constitutes natural as opposed to interested, right, lies in a religious sphere, a certain sort of expertise is needed. And it may be that the transformation of expertise, which has a lot to do with the creation of faculties in the universities outside of theology and so forth, that there's a story of changing location that needs to be brought in, as well as a story about the sort of depth, which is obviously the case.
Can I just respond to the Jordana's thing about a word that I don't often use, but basically you're asking about resistance. I mean, look, the Legion attempts. I mean, every attempt to try and create a new expert, system of standardization and regulation creates its own counterpoint. So, if you just take, the infamous mid-Victorian revolution in government, you have the anti-poor law movement against poor law, against the new poor law. You have the anti-vaccination movement. You have people the factory owners resisting factory inspection. You have, what else have I written down here? You have people like Joshua Tillman Smith valorizing local self-government and resisting what they consider to be Benthamite centralization, which is one of the reasons why all legislation in the 19th century takes that adoptive form. You have, I'm just thinking of my work on hunger. You have colonial nationalists, refuting the statistical claims about the generation of wealth or famine deaths in India. I mean, I don't think that there's any new mode of operation for the state which does not create its counterpart. And I think that's a very important and critical to the way in which the state itself develops. I think you have to critically think of it as a relationship.
Yeah, this is a question mainly for James and Ethan, I think, but perhaps you could all shed light. I just wanted to get back to the question of teleology that you sort of began with, Ethan. I mean, James, and I'm totally sympathetic with the story you just told, and I buy it completely, the expertise and the justifications for it and how legitimacy works and resistance. And there's a kind of logic to it, and as you were saying, sort of accruals on this complex, right? And I'm just wondering, you almost, started out, Ethan, with this story of other windows of other opportunities or other roads not taken. And I'm not sure if you thought they were dead ends from the outset or if they died, they just failed for contingent reasons. But one of the examples you mentioned was a city-state. And of course, we still have city-states. And in some sense, that's a difference of scale rather than real quality. I'm just wondering if you guys could just revisit this question of teleology. It almost sounded like you were agreeing at the end that it is kind of teleological and the modern state could kind of only develop in the way that it has. So I'm just wondering if you could clarify, and if when you all speak of dead ends, and everyone seemed intrigued by your idea of dead ends, did you think it was a foregone conclusion that they would be dead ends, or are there other possibilities besides city-states? And if the modern state, I'm sorry, this is turning into a hydra-headed question, if the modern state has a kind of logic, and the British state obviously is distinctive in ways that we've talked about, but obviously if you look around the world, I mean, there are a lot of different kinds of states out there. So how do we explain how it can be at once teleological and then, not at all?
I mean, I didn't mean that they were dead ends. What I meant was that they don't end up being the modern state, right? I mean that they go other places, but they don't stop. And so if we focus on the modern state, it might, it's the old problem of tracing a branch backwards, is you do in fact find the origins of the branch, but you don't see all the other branches, and they end up somewhere too. But that's the problem, is that the state does grow and becomes this huge, enormous, crucial element of modernity. And so it's
Are
not
you
that
all agreeing that this was kind of inevitable or teleological? Is that agreement?
No, I mean, the centrality of, my position is that there isn't a single thing called the modern state. There are competing visions of the modern state.
What about physically, materially?
Yeah, I mean, and that's right. I mean, my whole point is that these different visions manifest themselves in different institutions, different ways of governance, all sorts of things, and they're competing with one another. And in the British case, I sort of see two different traditions, but I think there's multiple traditions. I think you could, and I think that's why we need not to study single nations. We need always to do comparative work. And my view is that it is wrong to think that there is a single thing called the modern state. And it strikes me that that was the conclusion which Jerry Huff came to with that sort of brilliant piece on the Soviet modernity. I mean, that book, which I think never gets read anymore, but it strikes me as, it's a stunning sort of piece of work saying, look, to think of the Soviet state as not modern is ridiculous. But if it is modern, then we can't think of a single path to modernity the way that Rostow and others did, nor can we ever think about a single thing called the modern state. We always need to think about competing definitions, which means that we need to be very specific. And I think Ethan, in some ways, was sort of pointing to ways that we need to think about this, and I think in different ways everybody was doing this. If we think that there are competing definitions of the modern state, then we need to think what distinguishes the modern state from something which is not a modern state, which is not to say that we're always inevitably on a path to modernity, because it strikes me that there are some states in the world which exist which are not modern.
But they're part of modernity. I mean, which states are...
Modernity is not a temporal, for me, it's not a temporal concept.
Qualitative.
It's a yeah.
I found what you all said to be very eloquent and also very instructive, particularly because you made all these categories really complex. And I kept thinking about, and because I work between the 18th and 19th century, I'm always asking myself certain questions, not so much about modernity, but in working on the London Stock Exchange and finance capitalism, what's different and what's similar. And one of the big differences is kind of the building of Whitehall. Well, they built a building called the London Stock Exchange, and it does have extraordinary power, and power through investments and everything else. But what I've also been fixated on, working on this question of money and capitalism and speculation, is the role of, these are sort of more theoretical and maybe too literary for some of you, but space and time, right? So one of the things that's really interesting and suspect for the Victorians about speculation is that it's making money too quickly. It's making money in a hurry, which is why it can easily be likened to gambling in part. Now, they did make money more easily because you had the certain inventions of telegraph, then telephone, and not to mention railroads that do make the speed. So there is something that we all teach our students about sort of economic transformations, and that would be the way that speed makes the world both smaller and sort of larger, as the point was raised earlier. So I wondered, in thinking about the kind of nexus of what Steve was talking about, and then Frederick, I loved what you were saying, and then James, where, in terms of space and time, right, how are those useful at all to think in these terms, or because there is such an acceleration at some level that gets internalized, and which is maybe why everybody gets very anxious. Not that they're not anxious in 1650, or they certainly are, but like just there is something about our knowledge about what's happening in Melbourne and New York, and that's really quite different from 1845 or 1890 versus I don't know, it's 1789 even. So that this is really just to help me out here a little bit.
Should I go? Yeah. Well, one way to think about neo-Toryism, the way I define it, as a movement that really starts in the heart of the Scottish Enlightenment in the 1750s, even in the select society debates of Edinburgh, is that it draws on stadialism, on the notion of the four stages, but it comes to different conclusions than Smith or Hume. It sees the possibility of a balance, balancing different stages against each other, balancing highlands against lowlands, balancing Bengal against England, and so forth, right? The other thing I would say to it, and this maybe speaks more to James' definition of how to collapse distance, how to govern across distances. I think both Smith and the Natural Historical Project are about that. Smith, of course, wants to introduce a self-regulating mechanism such that you don't have to worry about distance.
Right.
Everything, his space and time will be completely homogenized, right? The space of capital. Right. Natural historians are up to something similar, but at a deeper level. They think if you can control the biological conditions of life and society, then you can set the sequence of a society. You can mastermind how it's going to develop.
I wanted actually to respond to both Maureen and Priya, who's left the room. So I'm going to respond to Maureen first, and then maybe Priya will come back. Yeah, I don't really have anything striking to say. I mean, I guess that the one way in which I would think about this would be that to go back to Mary Poover's work and say there are basically two processes here. One is the creation of abstract senses of space and of time, and the other is the forms of standardization and regulation that come in to make that to make them real. And I think the standardization of time particularly is an absolutely fascinating absolutely fascinating and deeply resisted process. Right, yeah. I'm going to respond to Priya, even though she isn't here. I want to agree with Steve on one side and disagree with him on another. I do agree. I do agree that the forms of statecraft that I've been talking about are contingent and contested. I mean, that was my whole point in trying to stress the unevenness of the process and the absolute vital role of civil society in that transformation. But I also want to, and I'm thinking this through, so you can all tell me that I'm ridiculous. But I actually am really fed up of all of this talk about alternative modernities. I actually believe that there is something called modernity, and that it takes a pretty uniform, forms, but that it has alternative settings locally. That is to say, there are these general processes, and I think the ones that I've highlighted for the state are true of many forms of statecraft, but the way in which that they develop, because they're contingent and contested, because they draw on local political traditions and social structures, are highly variegated. But the general process, it seems to me, is deeply familiar, if not uniform.
Even for the Soviet Union?
Yeah, even for the Soviet Union.
I don't think we agree. I think it's just I think it's a nominalism that I also disagree with most things that Professor Dwara says, but specifically what he says about alternative modernities when there's these different conceptions of time, etc. I just think that what one can say is that one could figure it out, although I haven't, a sort of prerequisites for what something needs to be a modern state, and then imagine that once you meet that minimum, that there are alternative patterns, and you can call them local patterns, I can call them alternative modern states. But I think basically we agree. I mean, I don't think that what Professor Dwara's notion of the third millennium BC China as a modern, as an alternative modernity, I think that's absolutely ridiculous. So I think we actually agree. It's just a terminological difference.
Great. The economic historians might be useful to us here, even though they're not here. But to economic historians, there is a modernity. It's very easy to find, and it's to do with this question of acceleration. But it's not the fact of acceleration. It's the fact of consistent and predictable acceleration. And so at that level, right, that acceleration is a crucial component of modernity, not because modernity is where you find it, but because modernity is always produced out of it, right?
Right, and absolutely, and this is, I mean, this move, well, from Smith, Malthusian to a Smithian state happens in the late 17th century, so they're right.
I want to step slightly away from modernity for a second and go back to a point that Ethan made that I think is very interesting. I'm sort of wondering about how broadly we can conceive of expertise. And I would argue that one of sort of the great sharp sort of wrestings of expertise was the Reformation and was the appropriation by the state of a sort of religious apparatus and religious expertise across the board. Not only is it a sort of we know better than you, and so you have to do what we say, but it expands, I think, the modes of operation. It puts us in this parish politics that we've been talking about throughout the course of the last 2 days. And it's also contested, as Steve would be happy to hear, with two, if not more, sort of very different ideas and ideologies of power and continuity and sovereignty, all come about over sort of contestations over the Reformation. So I'm wondering if that, for those of you who do take expertise to really be a sign of state formation, say, or appropriation of expertise as a sign of state formation, if you see parallels there, if you acknowledge that if this makes sense to you as a sort of a beginnings of things, do you see this as roots of things or simply another process altogether?
I think there's a clear contrast with the exciseman and your Reformation. It gets a little trickier once I argue that political economy is an instrument. You see what I mean? Because then you could say, well, the Bible, exegesis.
Oddly enough, I don't quite agree with that in the sense that I think that the religion is a crucial form of expertise, obviously, throughout the early modern period. But the state, the Elizabethan state, say, doesn't often claim religious expertise so much as it claims the legitimate right to require obedience, so that most often what the Elizabethan state is demanding is obedience in matters indifferent. That is, things which are neither required nor forbidden by religion, as in the most narrow sense, the state has purview over. So whether or not you want to wear vestments when you preach, since it doesn't say in the Bible that you have to or you may not, you're bloody well going to because we said so. All right. That's a different sort of thing than the expertise of a theologian or the expertise of a church that might determine whether usury, for instance, is or is not legitimate, right? I'm talking, I think, about the trajectory I'm drawing is a somewhat different sort of thing than a claim of power, or the ability to demand a certain sort of religion from subjects. That's what I was trying to get at.
I think Brendan was, you've got the mic.
I do indeed. Yeah, I mean, it seems that the expertise that they have in that situation is to know that their competitors are fraudulent, without sort of providing something on the other side. But I guess I want to push Lucy's question, Frederick, and say I think it's very interesting to hear about expertise and political economy in the 18th century. But I find this curious from a late 16th, early 17th century phenomenon. Massive plantations, the massive sort of, cartographic work, ethnographic work, William Petty, institutionalized in societies of learning. So what is it about, what is it about the 18th century that seems so strikingly new that hasn't been really, really carefully worked out in very close relationship with political power over the late 16th and very, very, very much so in the 17th century?
Right. I would sort of, I would use my, I guess one escape out of the dilemma is to say that the true sort of, the ascendancy of political economy, the sort of political impact of it in the Smithian vein comes late. That comes in the 19th century, right? So Smith is a man who doesn't really have a pulpit. He doesn't have a big institution behind him. I think the other way maybe to ask the question is how much of petty circulates in Parliament is institutionalized, right? Is it a one-man project or does it carry on? Is political arithmetic
other people who are surveying Ulster, surveying Munster, and make massive transformations in the landscape, the environment that lives there, how they act, trade, improvement. It's the language of improvement constantly. So,
Can I actually, because I think that this, I take your point. I'm slightly surprised that you put William Petty in the late 16th century. The manuscripts I've read have been mostly in the late 17th. But nevertheless, I do have a serious point to make, which is that I think one needs to, I think that the kind of intellectual, this is where one needs to distinguish between intellectual resources and institutions. I think you're absolutely right that in the governance of Munster, which strikes me as a sort of comes out of, not out of the state, but out of, through the crown. For exactly the reason that you say, this sort of interesting Anglo-Irish moment in the late Elizabethan, early Stuart period. What strikes me as remarkable about William Petty's careers is that there are 2 points in time when he is centrally working for the state. In the 1650s, and the 1690s, it's at the end of his life in the 1680s, when he actually is producing these projects for James II, largely about promoting Catholicism, but using political arithmetic to do this, and they are centrally state projects at that moment. There are other points in time throughout, the stuff which everybody knows about, the 1660s, 1670s, etc., where he's not working for the state, and it's being used for non-state projects. So I think what needs to, so it's not just about discourse, but it's about the relationship between discourse and institutions.
Okay, so I have 2 questions, and I do this because there's not Steve to ask multiple questions. The first is a slightly narrower question, which sort of applies to what Ethan and Steve had to say, because we haven't talked a whole lot about Massachusetts or New England in these discussions, but it strikes me that the sort of, path not taken of Puritan congregational government is a path that was, to a certain extent, taken in Massachusetts, that the city-state of Boston example is in the thick of this sort of, although the story that Mark Peterson is writing goes beyond that. And it seems to me that voluntarist model is, it's not clear to me whether that's an alternative to the Tory-Whig split that Steve is describing, or if it offers us, in the periods in which it overlaps and persists into the 17th and 18th centuries. Massachusetts meeting houses and the tradition of the New England meeting house is a sort of, you talk to some New Englanders who go to their town meeting, and it's a sort of sacrosanct tradition. That's the civil side, although I think it's deeply connected to the religious side. These meetings frequently took place in the village church in New England. So this is by way of asking a question of, to what extent are there perhaps more alternatives than the 2 that Steve was talking about? But this also, I think, dovetails with a broader question, which is for the whole panel, which is, it seems to me that Ethan made a very interesting point, that the state was in the 16th century the state was not capable of governing its subjects and its 16th century subjects, so that we invoke this idea of governmentality. And it struck me as quite interesting that James listed a number of different purviews that have sort of accrued to the state: military, judicial, social, cultural, etc. And it strikes me as maybe what we're seeing here is the addition of new forms because we're finding populations that are incapable of governing, that we're incapable of governing our population. So we're adding new sort of purviews to the state because we need it. But it seems to me that raises sort of 2 problems. One is, what happens when these different purviews conflict with one another? And I think we have a sort of conspicuous example of this now, in which the Justice Department is considering indicting, CIA people within the CIA for violating the law, which is to say we have, the security state is coming in conflict with the judicial state, and we can imagine, so that the political conflict that Steve talks about may also take place within the state itself as well as within the public sphere. But I guess my question is, why are we adding all of these different purviews? Because I don't know if we've really answered that. So, that's rather a lot. I'll just stop there.
Can I go first? And although I'm a little sad to do this because David just left the room and my pay rise is actually quite important and I was about to flatter him. I wanted to return to the point that he made yesterday, which was to remark upon the sort of layering of jurisdictions that happen in the patterning of legal authority, and I think that's absolutely right, and it's absolutely mirrored in the 19th and 20th century in terms of the different agencies of the state that develop. And that does create, and here I'm in complete agreement with everybody, that the state is not, clearly I'm in agreement that the state is not a monolith, and there are lots of different people fighting for its resources and for its authority. So I'm not quite sure how to answer the other question because I don't quite get it, but I'm going to let Ethan talk, and then if I get it, I'll have something more to say.
Well, I don't know how much more I have to say because you put it very well. Communities in New England established something like separate quasi-autonomous communities that were, on the one hand, part of larger modern states, if there was such a thing then, and on the other hand, maintained large amounts of autonomy from them. All right, the model through modernity has been to chip away at that autonomy as the state has taken over sort of more and more purviews. Now, religion is, of course, a conspicuous exception to that, but an exception in really interesting ways, because while religious toleration of some variety has been central to the liberal state, the state has nonetheless, through the very act of granting toleration over conscience, over internal religion, and where you worship, has claimed jurisdiction over vast, huge amounts of morality and the regulation of interpersonal interaction that previously the state had not controlled but had been under the purview of religion. Right? So it's a complicated issue, but the trajectory of the sort of New England town meeting, if you want to call it that, has been crucial to, say, the forms of public engagement in the United States and in Britain. They are not, however, at the center of the state and what it does. Right? So that's what I was trying to say. Again, it's this civil society state question, and maybe that's where the sort of issue is.
Can I say I have a very different answer to that question, although it's not clear to me that it strikes me that I was talking about an imperial state, and it's important to realize that the charter that Massachusetts Bay had was a royal charter. So I make a distinction between that kind of royal, personal kind of governance and state governance. And it strikes me that if you read backwards from Mark Peterson's story, his story of this Boston wanting to insist itself on a city-state appeals to an alternative tradition of the way in which societies expand, which is a Greek tradition. Yeah. And it strikes me that this is, this is a different model, but it's not a model of an imperial state. So it doesn't strike me as any way in tension with what I'm saying. It fits in very nicely with it.
I just wanted to add one. David, you missed a flattering remark by me about your fantastic commentary yesterday. Groveling aside, the other there was one other thing that I wanted to say, because I wanted to come back to Jordana's talk yesterday, which is to say that one of the critical dimensions of the growth of the state in the 19th century is the organisation of its archive. And indeed, just as I was talking about the way in which Whitehall was modelled to reflect the new functions and modes of operation of government in the 19th century, so you see that mirrored exactly in the organisation of its archive. So it's not, I don't quite know what you mean, but I guess my argument was not that I'm layering all these things, and I absolutely didn't use the word governmentality once. but that this was the way in which the exercise of power was divvied up.
My only additional comment would be that I see in this layering of jurisdictions, conflicting authorities, a source of paralysis and inertia in the late 18th century. And a good question would be the timber problem, where the Admiralty and the Navy Board are utterly convinced that England has run out of resources and is desperate. They commission an 1804 survey of global timber resources. But nothing happens, and nothing happens for years and years and years. By the time they've solved the issue, the war is over. And part of the inertia has to do with, again, a clash of expertise, where parliamentarians have a very different version of events.
Riyad has his hand up. Oh, but Priya's got the mic. So Priya and then and then Riyad.
Okay. I'm sorry to be irritating, but I just need to go back to that question about teleology. I just wanted to say that I just keep thinking about this. I'm sorry I'm getting a little hung up. But, you know, the description by Sidney Webb that you read, I can really, and I think all of us can see the through line from that to then, you know, like the welfare state or the contemporary British state today. And so it does seem like there's a logic kind of driving it and a series of accruals. But when Ethan was talking about, you know, the parish as sort of the basic building block that emerges in the early modern period to govern modern individuals, I don't so easily see a through line from that to even the Webb moment. And I'm just wondering then, I mean, I liked your idea of alternative paths that I think I don't know if you backed away from it or if, I don't know how committed you were to it in the first place, but I just was wondering, like, can you think of, or can anyone think of, I mean, it doesn't seem as inevitable starting from parishes to go to that. I don't see that logic. And the second question I had was about the conversation about alternative modernities, which I missed part of. And I just, you know, Steve, you were talking about how modernity doesn't have a temporal quality, and I think I understand what you mean. But I was thinking there's nothing, you know, so quintessentially modern as, you know, a failed state, for instance, like one of these failed post-colonial states, to pick any African country. And there's something that is, you know, modernity. And as you were saying, James, that there aren't different kinds of modernities, but it manifests differently in local settings. But that seems so radically different from our concept of, like, British modernity or French modernity that, I don't know, how would you talk about that or account for that? And it is obviously so tied to the nature of the states in those places. And I was just interested in what you guys would say about that.
Well, I mean, I have no interest in dealing in inevitabilities. I mean, I think a trajectory can be drawn, and Mike Braddock has drawn a big chunk of it. No, I mean in his work. I mean, but I won't rehearse that. I mean, but I would not deal in inevitabilities. I think I could make a case that the civil parish as a way of creating a regulatory apparatus in addition to a apparatus of coercion and enforcement is the sort of crucial building block that gets you there in practice. But did it have to? No. I mean, it had collapsed before, and it could have collapsed again. Right?
I can. Well, why don't we let Mike jump in and then?
Well, we're
actually trying to get us on another issue.
Right. Oh,
okay. Is David here? David Annixter? Yeah. So what is it that the parish is doing at the end of the 19th century? I mean, what is left of its jurisdiction? It basically is left, I think, just repairing streets by the late 19th century, by 1884.
That might be right.
David, do you know? David Lieberman, do you know?
I don't know.
Right.
But I think it is that, whatever it is, it's the residual stuff that hasn't yet been absorbed.
And I think it's only, I think it's only the repair of streets by 1884. So it has a great rejuvenation in the 19th century, but it's one that's pretty quickly eclipsed. I wanted to come back to the modernity issue. I don't think that modernity is a temporal category at all. I think it's I think it's a qualitative category, a condition. So it makes no difference. I mean, so a state isn't modern because it's 2009.
Right. But the condition of modernity is so different in, say, like Nigeria or something, from the condition of modernity in Britain. How would you? How do you then discount the idea of...
Well, I mean, so I define my characteristics, and then I would go looking to see if those characteristics are there, and if they're not there, then I wouldn't be describing it as a modern state, or indeed...
Yeah, and I think that last is the central thing. I mean, there's modernity as it's been used in sort of philosophical discourse is not talking... I mean, it's talking about the state and a whole bunch of other things. And it strikes me that our discussion... I mean, you can be much more specific, much more precise if you want to talk about the modern state or the modern economy or whatever it is. And so we shouldn't be talking about the condition of modernity as a concept. We should be being much more specific, much more precise, and much more limited. And in that, I mean, I completely agree, but I think that the key term here is modern state.
So there was a bunch of hands. So we're definitely due to go to Riyadh. I can see Penny's hand up. Does anyone else want to go to
Mike.
Oh, Mike. Sorry. So Riyadh, Mike, and then Penny. And that should do us, I think.
So I wanted to address the question that Priya was just asking and to pick up on some remarks that James had made in his initial statement, and to address this question of the post-colonial state and its relationship to the British state, and to think about this little category called the colonial state that's more important in another field like South Asia or African studies, but hasn't been spoken of at great detail here. And there are two features of that to think about to understand maybe how we get to post-colonial states that may or may not fit within the different kinds of definitions of what the modern state is that have run through this conversation over the last 2 days. So the two conditions would be to pick up on a remark by Henry Sumner Maine in his lectures on international law about the divisibility of sovereignty. And as such, you can have suzerain-sovereign relationships between the British state and then native princes or other kinds of customary states that only have partial sovereignty. And then the second question would be the means and mechanisms of representation in colonial states, which lead to divisive political institutions which have resulted in the forms of communalism and tribalism and racial division and so forth that have characterized many post-colonial regimes. So the point being that the career of the division of sovereignty and the division of political community is part of the career of the British state. And how do we integrate that into our conception of what a modern state could be?
Riyadh, I mean, it strikes me. I mean, the point which I sort of made at the end of my talk about the division of the British state actually came from my reading of the colonial South Asian literature. That is to say, and sort of reading it back, but rejecting the sort of fundamental assumption that a lot of this literature begins with, that there's a fundamental distinction between Britain and India. And so if one rejects that, but then appropriates some of the categories, I think that's why. I mean, I sort of said what I said at the end, that this sort of divisive, that the very division of the state actually creates both in what we later come, if we accept the sort of Tory terms, the metropole, these kinds of problems of exactly what you talk about, and in the former colony. And I think it's precisely because of this division, whereas, and I want to sort of add a caveat to this, whereas it strikes me when you get unitary imperial states, like Spain, for example, I mean, which is unitary with respect to the empire, not with respect to Iberia. I mean, this is an important distinction to make. You actually don't get these, you don't end up getting these kind of well, let's just say racialized divisions, although one could talk about various things, in either the former colony or in the metropole. Now, that said, on the one hand, all of the recent work in political science, and here I'm thinking about the work of Stephen Wilkinson, John Gehring and others, has suggested economically that the divided state actually leads to more successful economic outcomes. So you get racialized divisions, but you get more economic outcomes, and these are the positive economic outcomes. So these are the kinds of balances that one has to play in these sort of notions. Anyway, I mean, that's, but I think, I mean, I absolutely agree that the South Asian literature is something that we need to bring back. I mean, in particular, the South Asian literature, that's the stuff I know. But I'm sure this would be, I mean, if I knew something about Africa, I would say, I mean, it sounds like it's a similar sort of literature. And there is this kind of similar literature discussing some bits of Latin America at the moment. But I absolutely agree with the sort of theoretical position that you're taking.
Thanks. I've been hesitating to speak because I've been getting too much free advertising already. But 2 points, really. One is, this is a response to James to say that I don't really disagree with you, I don't think. When I came to try to narrate change in the early modern state, what I tried to do in this Foucauldian soup I'd created of dispersed power and so on was look at patterns in the interaction between four elements, the languages and sources of legitimacy used in relation to B, a functional purpose being addressed, C, the institutional expression which embodied that legitimacy and that function, and then the social interests in play behind these institutional expressions. And I ended up with domestically three crystallizations. One was patriarchal, one was confessional, and one was fiscal military. And it seems to me that that gets us past some of the problems of looking for a moment when the state in its entirety becomes modern. And Steve's quite right. I did make a case for modernity in some aspects of the fiscal military state in the late 17th century, and particularly interestingly around the excise. And what strikes me as the difference between the picture you paint and the picture I paint is the way in which what is a small part of the late 17th century state has migrated and become institutionalized. The scientization of expertise, the institutionalization of expertise, and the application of the statistical approach to social problems, which was much less marked in the patriarchal state, where you didn't quantify the problem of sin, but you addressed it in patriarchal and religious terms. And so it seems to me if you really want to, and why not, if you really want to look at the marker of modernity, it's the migration of that particular style and instantiation of state power across a full range of functions. Right. And the fact that diverse social groups all appeal to the same languages of legitimacy and seek their expression in the same forms of political power. So I think you and I methodologically are not a million miles apart. That seems to me to be the marker of modernity rather than ambition, because it's certainly clear that the 16th century state was enormously ambitious. And it may not even be that the 16th century state was always less potent than a modern state. And I take my classic classroom example, horrifies my students. Early modern states could change the way that young people had sex. It's really powerful intervention into private life, which a modern state frequently just doesn't even bother to try to do. And even in these more quantifiable fiscal military areas, if you're taking the share of government activity of disposable income rather than of total income, again, the early modern performance is frequently startling. In the Civil War, the government supported the equivalent of the three largest cities in the country, London aside, in arms, in wages, feeding and clothing them. That's a really remarkable level of mobilisation, it strikes me. So I'm reluctant to accept a distinction between early modern and modern on ambition. I'd qualify claims about potency, but I do accept this case about style and the instantiation of state power. And there it seems to me that this stuff on expertise and its institutionalization and the way it migrates across the full range of state functions is really crucial.
I think I'm talking on a similar topic as Mike was expressing, except just coming from a different angle. One of the things I wanted to reiterate or say what I thought James was saying in terms of how he sees what's modern about the modern state, because I thought it disagreed with this idea of accrual, a state just growing bigger. I wanted to, in the specific way in which James said that it's not a monolith and that it's not inevitable. I mean, that's part of it, is that it's a problem-centered state, and so that it's solving new problems. And what makes it modern is that the problems are new because the state is now solving them in a particular way, and that they're more complex problems because there's no overarching. It's not just that demographics have changed, it's not just that the economy has changed, but I think that the competing systems, and in Britain, obviously, religious systems of values, and these competing systems of values don't tell any single group or any single individual how to behave. And so that the state is now, an expertise in particular, is seen as a neutral ground through which to solve these problems. And so I think that the problem-centered, and why James picks, why it has so many start dates that are modern, or that makes them modern, is because they're solving particular problems. And by looking at following problems, you're not talking about a monolithic state. You're talking about a sort of response and creation. Then it creates departments and so on, in a kind of McDonough fashion. I don't know if that was what you were saying, but I just wanted to reiterate that because it seemed like it was different from it is qualitatively different from an early modern state in that sense. It's not just about scale. It's not just about more people. It's more diverse people who don't have any kind of overarching, or I don't know if that's the right term, but whatever.
No, I think that's broadly right, but I would emphasize, as we were yesterday, that that there isn't this thing called the state creating these new problems. I mean that that this is that there's a whole range of groups, and that civil society is absolutely fundamental to this process. But it's the way in which those new problems get discussed and then addressed that appears very novel. Which is not to say there isn't a continuity of the old questions of values and ethics.
A great example might be, for instance, the increasing mobilization of soldiers from Ireland and the Scottish Highlands who are Catholics, right? And so that creates an impetus for Catholic relief legislation, or creates an atmosphere where it becomes thinkable for people like Wellington, ultra-Tories, or Tories at least, and Henry Dundas to embrace the idea.
We are at 4 o'clock, so are there any final questions, or are we all going to go and dive into the pool at Strawberry Canyon?
I actually wanted to sort of play with Mike's suggestion and maybe think about, it does strike me, and it also sort of go back to the point you made about archives, because I do think that this is important, but not exactly in the way. So I think Mike's absolutely right. The move towards quantification is an absolutely fundamental qualitative shift. Although again, I think it's you need the stuff that you talked about before. It's extremely important. So the elaboration of political arithmetic and the movement of this across almost every section of state activity, which is precisely what happens in the period between in the period between 1696 and 1730, say. So you actually see the quantification of these various commissions studying the church in the 1720s and 1730s are using quantitative techniques in the way that at least I never saw anything before. So you see it in ecclesiastical realms. The supposed dark ages of economic history exist precisely because it's in 1696 that you begin getting quantifiable data to talk about the economy. You end up quantifying, creating various attempts to quantify people in various the number of people in various colonies, the number of products of these things. things, the numbers of these actual lists just absolutely proliferate after this in this period. And this is, I mean, you can actually see this by sort of comparing the papers of people like Harley, well, I mean, people like Harley or Walpole to mid 17th century or late 16th century politicians, and just the fact that there are just page after page after page of numbers is just remarkable. But the related point that I want to make is I think the sort of creation of these archives is absolutely important, is absolutely central. And the creation of the State Paper Office doesn't happen in the 19th century. It happens, basically in Ethan's period. I mean, in a very real sense. The creation of the Colonial Office is also not a 19th century formation. The creation of the Colonial Office as a separate archive is created in 1696. The creation of the Foreign Office as a separate archive, again, normally assumed to happen much later, but actually if you read the minutes, the beginnings of the Foreign Office archive, although it isn't fully instantiated, is also a phenomenon of the 1730s and 1740s. Now what they do is they can't figure out what to put in the old state papers foreign category, what to put in the Foreign Office category, but again, it's a mid-18th century formation. So if you focus on this question of archive, creation of archive, I mean, I take your point that there's an elaboration of all sorts of new categories, but the fundamental shift is something which, I mean, archivally, is something that happens again in this period between the 16th century and the middle of the 18th century.
And I would stress, too, that a crucial precondition of this is not coming out of the state or even out of these experts, it's coming out of the market. And I was thinking of Craig Muldrew's work and thinking about the rise of numeracy and the ways in which more people needing to buy and sell things for a living results in more people being able to actually count things and add things and compare columns of things, and that this is a sort of crucial precondition coming out of civil society for the technologies that make possible state interventions.
Yeah. Although there's a way in which this is also shaped by the central government because the merchants are responding to a certain sense to the state's desire to tax things. So.
Okay, I think we've been at this for 2 hours. It's a very hot room, and however brilliant we all are, and clearly we are very brilliant, it's time to bring this to a halt. I'd like to thank my colleagues for fantastic papers, and I'd like to thank you lot for fantastic questions all weekend. I don't know whether we have any other business to perform.
Will you tell us what happened in the Cal-Oregon game?
No.
That's 42-3. Oh my gosh.
Oh, it's so sad.
See, you're not really an employee of a public university. You haven't embraced it.
The very last thing that I'll say is thank you all for coming. I know it's a hard time of year to be travelling to conferences on the other side of the country, and I hope that as many of you as we can possibly afford, and as many of you who have the appetite, will join us in London next year for a continuation of these discussions. And thank you for all of our great panel speakers that have flown in from all parts of North America and the UK.
Not you.
Thanks to you guys for organizing it.